John Kinuthia is here with us as we unpack the Nduta case and what are the possibilities of us as a country managing to convince the Vietnam government to get her home so that she can undergo trial according to the Kenyan standards. So here we are, our foreign policy. What do you make of it? Do you think we should rethink it?
Foreign policy is a very technical and also very comprehensive craft. It usually requires a lot of forethinking, foreplanning. You need usually a strategy, and behind that strategy should be very sound principles informed by the vision that we have for how we should relate with our neighbors and those who are near and far, and also by the mission that we have. We've seen in previous years that Kenya is very influential in the world. We've had a seat in the UN Security Council. We've had a very influential diplomats at all levels, the UN ambassador, the US ambassador, the ambassadors to most of the G7, G20 countries. We've had a very comprehensive foreign policy. The challenge comes in three ways. One, I've already hinted at it, when you don't have a proactive strategy that you preempt issues before they come.
Right.
So we do notice that to some extent our foreign policy is very reactive. It comes in retrospect after the fact, after something has happened. But also in some ways, not very deliberate in terms of foreplanning and the structural arrangements. For example, in this particular case, we're talking about a country where we do not have diplomatic representations. We don't have an embassy. We don't have the staffing that an embassy usually requires.
And this is something that most Kenyans realize at this very stage. And one wants to ask, why is it the case? I mean, what informs for a country to have an embassy in a certain country and not to have an embassy in a certain country?
Sure. Diplomatic relations are very complex. Initially, they are based on alliances, especially after a war, depending on which side a country was aligned to. So when you talk about the Western countries, Kenya has enjoyed very good relationships with the Western countries. There's a time that became a bit, thawed. And for example, you had a foreign diplomat come and say that elections have consequences. And then after that, you noticed we drifted off from the Western sort of close ties to sort of ties in Asia and other places. We had a more broad spectrum foreign policy in terms of hedging our bets with different superpowers. The Russians, the Chinese, the BRICS sort of alliance, as well as NATO alliance. Recently, we've seen Kenya go back more to the Western alliance. So some of the diplomatic relationships will come from, for example, the US was involved in a war in Vietnam. So you'll notice the countries that have diplomatic relationships with Vietnam, bilateral, so to speak, which means it's a two-way street, will usually be countries that in one way took one side or the other. So due to that and many other consequences and our alliances and the complex nature of politics and leadership at a geopolitical global stage, you find that we will have embassies. Even they don't have an embassy here. So now the second part is usually diplomatic relationships can be triggered by events. This event certainly will trigger a diplomatic relationship. And if there's goodwill on both sides, will culminate usually in a two-way relationship. For example, you do hear that there was a former president who made a call to somebody he knows. So geopolitical relationships have a mix of personal and then leadership and then historical ties and geopolitical issues that affect. Long short of it is, ideally, a country should have diplomatic representation everywhere, but factors like trade, security, economics, a lot of factors do sort of go into the decision. Do we have sufficient interest in this country to have a diplomatic presence there, and do they have those with us? The other flip side of the coin is that the breaking down of diplomatic relationships is usually even as serious as a signal of impending war. So when you recall your ambassador to a certain country, or you chase away some country's ambassador. We just saw, some some interesting dynamics between the US and the South Africans, where the US has kicked out the South African ambassador or said he's no longer welcome. So those dynamics, diplomatic relations are super sensitive, but when they are latent and stalled and quiet like they've been between Kenya and Vietnam, it's almost easy not to notice we don't have that kind of relationship. But this sort of event will trigger some sort of quest towards formal diplomatic relationships.
All right, it is a developing story, and we'll certainly be here to follow the same, just to make sure that you are updated. John Kenneth here, governance and security expert, as well as the executive chairperson, chief executive strategies and solutions. Asante sana for the great quick insights as to this matter. As I have said, we continue following on the same and the developments of the same to keep you posted. Now, the